At my son's wedding, my daughter-in-law asked me to stand to the side so you don't ruin the pictures. I just smiled and took a quiet step back. What they didn't know was that the photographer was one of my former students, and he hadn't forgotten who helped shape his career. He didn't say a word. He simply lifted his camera and began to shoot. 2 weeks later, when the family album made its way through every relative's inbox, a quiet revelation followed. In every frame, there I was, captured in perfect light, flawless angles, centered, no confrontation, no revenge, just art. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Evelyn Harper. I was 67 years old when the invitation arrived. A retired photography professor from a Boston community college, I had spent most of my adult life helping students see the world more clearly through a lens. My late husband, Thomas, had been my steady counterpart, quiet, meticulous, always reminding me to take care of myself between lectures and darkroom sessions. We built a good life, modest but meaningful, centered around our only child, Adam. After Thomas passed, my world shrank. Not immediately, of course. At first, there were condolences, casseroles, kind neighbors dropping by. But grief has a way of emptying a home so gradually you hardly notice until it echoes. Adam visited less often. He moved in with Julia, his girlfriend at the time, who would later become his fiancée. She was sleek, modern, always dressed like she was heading to a photo shoot. A woman who edited her emotions like she did her Instagram filters, carefully, calculating what should be shown and what must remain cropped out. The invitation came on a gray Thursday. It arrived by post, sandwiched between a grocery store circular and a bill I hadn't opened. The envelope was ivory, thick, embossed with swirls of gold foil. It looked expensive. I remember holding it for a moment before opening it, the weight of it sitting strangely in my palm, as if something formal had crept into the casual ruin of my life. Inside was a tri-fold card. The names Adam and Julia stretched across the front in calligraphy. Below, a printed message. We are delighted to invite you to celebrate our wedding at the White Pines Estate. There was no note. No, Mom, I can't wait to see you, or looking forward to sharing this day. Just an itinerary, dress code, and a link to the gift registry. It was signed with a machine script, with love, Adam and Julia. I stared at it for a long while at my kitchen table. The late afternoon light was shifting across the floor, and the house smelled faintly of the tea I had brewed earlier. My name wasn't handwritten. Nothing about it was personal. I was one name among many, a seat filler, a relic to be positioned quietly and out of the frame. I wasn't surprised, not really. There had been distance growing for years. After Adam moved in with Julia, his visits turned into calls. Then his calls turned into texts. And finally, even those became sparse, mostly reminders or brief questions. I was no longer someone to confide in. I was a checkpoint, an obligation. Still, I found myself running my fingers along the gold lettering. The White Pines Estate. It was the kind of venue people posted about, all chandeliers and manicured lawns. I imagined Julia walking the property weeks in advance, choosing where the photographs would be best, where the sunlight would fall at the right angle for her gown. I imagined she'd already decided where I would sit, or more accurately, where I wouldn't. I could have declined. I could have told them the date didn't work, or that I wasn't feeling well, or that traveling was difficult at my age. But I knew those would be lies. And more than that, I knew the silence that would follow wouldn't hurt them. It would only hurt me. I didn't want to give Julia the satisfaction of saying I hadn't shown up. I wouldn't let Adam's memory of me become a story she retold as bitterness. I needed to be there, not for the ceremony, not even for him, but for myself. I pressed the card closed and set it down. Then I looked around my kitchen, the same place I used to make pancakes for Adam on Sunday mornings, where I taught him to crack eggs without getting shell in the batter. The same kitchen he hadn't stepped foot in for nearly a year. Dust had begun to settle on the picture frames. A stack of mail sat untouched on the counter. My life had become quiet, deliberate, and largely invisible. I got up, walked to the hall closet, and pulled down the garment bag that held my best dress, a navy blue silk wrap with a hem that moved like water when I walked. I hadn't worn it since Thomas's retirement dinner. I ran my hand over the fabric, then hung it carefully on the door. There would be time to try it on later. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering what kind of mother I had been to raise a son who could forget the warmth that raised him. But I didn't cry. I hadn't cried in years. Instead, I let the silence settle into me like sediment, layer after layer. I knew what I had to do. I would go to that wedding. I would stand where they placed me, and I would see everything. Because I hadn't spent a lifetime teaching people how to see, only to let myself be unseen. The estate was grander than I had expected. Nestled in the hills north of the city, it looked like something out of a wedding magazine. Stone columns, wide oak doors, and trimmed hedges leading into a courtyard where white chairs were already arranged in perfect rows. The sky was an obedient blue, the kind that makes everything beneath it look curated and intentional. I arrived early, as I always did, not to make a scene, but because I didn't want to feel rushed, to feel like I was crashing something already in motion. I had taken a car service, not wanting to deal with parking or directions. The driver dropped me off by the entrance, offered a quiet nod, and drove away. I stood there for a moment, looking at the building that would host the joining of my son's life with another woman's. The air smelled of roses and expensive perfume, faint traces of cinnamon from some cocktail I imagined being passed on silver trays. It all felt cold, staged. Even the warmth of the day didn't reach beneath my skin. When I walked through the doors, no one greeted me. A young woman with a clipboard glanced up, asked for my name, then motioned toward the courtyard. I wasn't handed a program or shown a seat. No small talk, no kind glances. I moved slowly, scanning the faces already gathered. Stylish women in beige and pearl, men in tailored suits with handkerchiefs poking out of their pockets. These weren't family. These were curated guests, part of Julia's perfect visual narrative. I recognized a few distant relatives, names I hadn't heard in years, faces softened or sharpened by time. None of them looked surprised to see me, but none came to speak either. I became aware of the dress I'd worn, how it moved gently when I walked, how it stood out against the pastel palette everyone else had chosen. I didn't feel underdressed or overdressed. I felt uninvited, despite being on the list. They had placed me at the far edge of the seating arrangement, the last row, not among Adam's college friends or his cousins, not near the aisle where the ceremony would take place, just close enough to witness, but far enough to be excluded. My seat was next to a couple I barely knew, acquaintances from Thomas's distant side of the family. They nodded politely but didn't engage. The woman turned back to her phone. The man reached for his glass of champagne and stared ahead. The decorations were impeccable. White flowers with soft pink accents curled along the aisle like a river of blooms. Candles floated in glass vases. A small string quartet played background music, each note so soft it might have floated away unnoticed. It was all beautiful, but it didn't feel like anything I belonged to. I wasn't part of this world. I wasn't part of this story. People began to gather in clusters, laughing, adjusting jackets, taking photos. I saw Adam at a distance, his back turned. He looked handsome, strong. He had filled out over the years. I noticed how he reached to adjust his tie, the way Thomas used to. For a moment, my heart ached. I wanted him to turn, to look for me, to catch my eye. But he didn't. His world rotated around other orbits now, around Julia. When she entered the courtyard, all eyes turned. Julia looked like she'd stepped out of a bridal editorial. Sleek dress, hair in perfect waves, smile bright but rehearsed. She moved like someone used to attention. The room, if it could be called that, bent around her. She passed within a few feet of where I was sitting. Her eyes flicked in my direction but didn't linger. It wasn't coldness, not exactly. It was calculation, a silent reminder that I was not a central figure today. The ceremony began shortly after. Music swelled. People rose. I followed suit, the last to stand. From my seat, I couldn't see much. Heads blocked most of the view, but I stayed still, watching shadows shift across the stone floor, watching how Adam reached for Julia's hand, how she smiled for the cameras, how the officiant spoke with that familiar blend of reverence and distance. I listened. I watched. I let myself feel the full weight of being peripheral, not unwanted, but unneeded. Not hated, but not loved in the way I remembered. The contrast between the past and the present was quiet but sharp. I remembered birthday parties where Adam would run to me with icing on his fingers. I remembered reading to him until he fell asleep, how he used to call me his favorite person. Now I was sitting among strangers, my role reduced to a placeholder. No one asked how I was. No one leaned over to whisper a warm word. I sat through the entire ceremony unnoticed, my hands folded in my lap, my heart both heavy and oddly numb. I wasn't angry, not yet. I wasn't even surprised. But something inside me shifted that afternoon, not like a crack or a shatter, more like a slow turning of a lock. I began to see things more clearly, like I used to teach my students. When the light hits from the right angle, what's blurry becomes sharp. I realized that this wedding wasn't just a celebration. It was a curtain call on my role as mother, a quiet reassignment of who belonged where. And I understood, maybe for the first time, that I was no longer part of their framing. But I was still watching, still seeing. And I knew how powerful an observer could be. The rehearsal began just as the sun was beginning to dip, casting a warm golden hue across the courtyard. Everything had been planned to the minute. Coordinators moved like dancers on a stage, adjusting flowers, directing people, checking clipboards with mechanical focus. I stood quietly near a stone column, observing the chaos masked as elegance. No one had told me what to do, where to be, or whether I should even be involved. I was used to that now, this sense of being an extra in someone else's carefully scripted play. Guests laughed and chatted while being placed for photo lineups. Bridesmaids huddled around Julia, touching up her lipstick and adjusting the train of her gown. Groomsmen cracked jokes, sipping from flasks that were supposed to be hidden. The photographer gave rapid directions, positioning everyone like figurines in a dollhouse. I knew the rhythm of these rehearsals. I'd taught students how to photograph events like this for decades. I knew where the light would fall, where tension would hide behind smiles, how the best photographs were always the ones no one noticed being taken. And yet, in this moment, I wasn't a teacher or an artist. I was just a woman in the background, holding her purse a little too tightly. When they called for immediate family, I waited, unsure. No one looked in my direction. Eventually, I stepped forward hesitantly and joined the group forming near the altar. I tried not to overthink it. I found a spot near Adam, my eyes searching his face, hoping for a flicker of connection. He didn't notice me at first. He was adjusting his cufflinks, distracted by the chatter around him. Julia stood across from him, luminous and composed as always. That's when she noticed me. She looked in my direction with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her voice was light, sweet on the surface, but sharp beneath. She asked me to move, not far, just a step or two to the side. So the photos would look cleaner, she said. Her tone was apologetic, as if she were doing me a favor. She mentioned lighting, angles, something about visual balance, but the meaning was clear. I was in the way. The center wasn't for me, not in the photo, not in their lives. I didn't argue. I nodded. I moved. The photographer didn't flinch. He simply shifted the frame, raised the camera again, and continued shooting. Everyone adjusted seamlessly, as if this were the natural order, as if I had never belonged in the center to begin with. I took my new place at the edge of the group. A few people gave me polite smiles, fleeting, empty. I returned them with practiced calm. No one saw how my fingers gripped the strap of my bag just a little tighter. No one noticed the way I stared at the ground for a few seconds longer than necessary, collecting myself. I had raised Adam with the belief that love was not about attention, but presence. I had never demanded the spotlight, never insisted on gratitude or tribute. I had been the quiet backbone, the one who made sure the camera had batteries, that the lunchbox was packed, that the science project was glued and dried on time. And now I was being edited out, not with cruelty, but with indifference, and somehow that hurt more. As the rehearsal continued, I kept to the side. I watched them walk through the vows, practice the timing, rehearse the laughter they'd later share with guests. Julia's mother fluttered from place to place, receiving compliments, answering questions, posing with grace. She was radiant, the archetype of the proud mother-in-law. She belonged. She was welcome. Her place was not questioned. The photographer called for more photos, this time with friends, extended family, different combinations. I wasn't called again. No one noticed, and I stopped expecting it. I found a bench at the edge of the garden and sat alone, folding my hands in my lap, watching the light soften over the treetops. It wasn't bitterness that filled me. It was clarity, the kind that arrives in silence after too many almosts and maybes. I understood that Julia didn't hate me. That would have taken effort. Instead, she had simply erased me from the narrative she was crafting because I didn't fit the aesthetic, the story, the polished image she had designed. But I knew something she didn't. I knew how to see, how to frame the truth, even when no one else noticed it. I had spent a lifetime capturing the invisible, glances, shadows, truths that didn't announce themselves. And now I was the one unseen, but not erased. Sometimes the most powerful figures in an image are the ones who stand just outside the center. I remained still, watching the fading rehearsal, the clicking camera, the shifting faces. No one looked for me. No one asked if I was cold or tired or needed anything. And that was fine. I didn't need their validation because I wasn't going to disappear. The next morning, I arrived early again. The ceremony wasn't until late afternoon, but I couldn't bear the thought of waiting alone in my rented room. The estate's gardens were open, still damp from the sprinklers, and the staff moved quietly, setting up chairs, arranging flowers, placing final touches on what would soon become someone's perfect memory. I walked slowly along the edge of the grounds, avoiding the center like I had been taught. Even now, I found comfort in staying unnoticed. As I neared the trellis where the photographs were being staged, I saw the photographer again. He was tall, lean, mid-30s perhaps, with the kind of presence that seemed always in motion. His camera rested against his chest, and he moved through the setting like a conductor surveying his orchestra. I hadn't paid him much attention the night before, not really. But now, as he adjusted his lens and crouched down to test an angle, something stirred in my memory. There was something familiar in the way he moved, how he tilted his head while scanning light and shadow. His hands worked the camera with muscle memory, not just skill. That's what caught my eye. Not what he did, but how he did it. I had taught my students that photography wasn't about pressing a button. It was about knowing the moment before it happened. I watched him from a distance for a few minutes. He didn't notice me at first. He was too focused on his work. Then, as he stepped back from a column to test the lighting against a white wall, he looked up and saw me standing by the hedge. He paused. His expression shifted just slightly, from concentration to recognition. He stared a moment longer, as if confirming what his memory was telling him. Then he smiled, not the polite kind offered to guests, but the kind that comes from remembering something that mattered. He approached slowly, without any sense of rush or obligation. When he stopped in front of me, I saw it clearly. His eyes, steady, thoughtful, hadn't changed much since I'd last seen them behind the lens of a secondhand film camera in my classroom more than a decade ago. He said my name, not Mrs. Harper, not ma'am, my full name. It was then I remembered. Nathan Pierce. He had been one of the quiet ones in class, always staying late, always asking about light and timing, but never interrupting, never trying to impress. His final project had been a collection of portraits taken in the laundromat where his mother worked, honest, raw, filled with humanity. I had written a note on his grade sheet that said, "You don't just take pictures, you witness." I hadn't forgotten that, and apparently neither had he. We didn't say much. We didn't need to. Recognition hung in the air between us like something sacred. There was a sense of understanding that passed silently, a thread connecting the past and the present. I saw it in the way he looked at me, not as a guest, not even as Adam's mother, but as someone who had once seen something in him worth believing in. He told me that my class had changed his life, that he still remembered how I talked about the story behind the silence, that he wouldn't have gotten his first internship if I hadn't written him a reference letter he hadn't even known I sent. I didn't say much, I didn't need to, but I saw the respect in his posture, the quiet gratitude, and I realized that I hadn't been forgotten by everyone, that something I had given, my time, my teaching, my attention, had taken root somewhere and grown into something real. He didn't ask questions. He didn't pry. He just nodded and then lifted his camera again, stepping back as someone called his name. But before he turned away, he gave me a look, a small, quiet promise. It was not a grand gesture. There were no speeches, no dramatic acknowledgments, just a recognition, a silent restoration of something I hadn't even known I needed. For the rest of the morning, I kept to the edge of the crowd as people arrived. Laughter filled the air, heels clicked on stone, champagne glasses clinked against each other. I watched as Julia floated from one guest to another, radiant, composed, rehearsed. I saw Adam laughing with friends, his arm draped around someone's shoulder. He didn't look for me. I didn't expect him to, but I saw Nathan slipping between groups, adjusting angles, guiding people into position. And every now and then, I caught his eye, just briefly, and each time he raised his camera slightly, as if to say, I see you. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about being witnessed. I knew from years of teaching that the best photographs weren't the ones with perfect smiles. They were the ones that captured contradiction, complexity, the way a hand tightens around a wine glass or a glance lingers too long. Nathan remembered that, and he saw me, not just as someone's mother, not just as a guest who had been pushed aside. He saw me as a person, as a story worth framing. The ceremony unfolded like a symphony written in someone else's key. Every detail was precise. The aisle had been dusted with white rose petals that matched the florals on the arch. The bridesmaids wore champagne silk. The groomsmen coordinated with matching ties and pocket squares. Nothing was out of place, at least not visually. I took my assigned seat once again at the very edge, near the back, beneath a tree that cast long shadows over the stone path. The sun filtered through its leaves in fractured patterns, and I sat quietly, blending into the scenery. I wasn't a disruption. I wasn't a participant. I was a silent witness. The guests murmured with excitement as music swelled from the quartet. I watched Julia appear at the end of the aisle, escorted by her father, every eye turning toward her as if on cue. She moved slowly, deliberately, and the crowd collectively inhaled, a sound of admiration and anticipation that washed over the space like applause. Adam waited beneath the arch, fidgeting slightly. I saw the exact moment when his gaze softened, the corners of his mouth lifting into something more vulnerable than I'd seen in years. I watched it all, not just the bride and groom, but the movements between the moments. I watched Julia's mother dab her eyes with a lace handkerchief, how Adam's shoulders relaxed when Julia reached him. I saw the way the best man gently squeezed Adam's shoulder before stepping back. I watched everyone. It had become second nature. And somewhere in the hum of it all, I realized I was being watched too, not by the guests, not by the officiant, but through the quiet, steady eye of a lens. Nathan was working the crowd the way I'd taught generations of students to work light. He moved like water, flowing through narrow spaces, stepping into shadow and back into sunlight without disturbing a soul. But his focus wasn't only on the couple. I noticed the way his camera lifted each time I moved, even slightly, the way he watched for something beyond the posed perfection. He caught me reaching into my handbag for a tissue, not to cry, but to clean my glasses, though it must have looked tender. He captured me tucking a strand of hair behind my ear as a breeze drifted through the aisle. He saw when I leaned forward ever so slightly during the vows, not because I couldn't hear, but because I needed to see Adam's face. I wasn't posing. I wasn't even aware I was being recorded, and that's precisely why he focused on me. He circled the perimeter of the event with a quiet confidence, and every time I caught his eye through the crowd, I felt something settle in my chest. A stillness, a kind of unspoken dignity I hadn't realized I was missing. He wasn't documenting just a wedding. He was telling a story, and in his story, I was not omitted. At the reception, I found myself at the far table, near the bar, next to a hedge that had been trimmed into a geometric wall. My name card was simple, misspelled. No one brought me a drink or asked if I needed anything. I sipped water and ate in small bites while the rest of the party bloomed around the dance floor. Nathan never asked me to pose. He never directed me, never instructed me to smile or turn my face or lift my chin. He simply noticed. He took a photo of me smiling softly as I watched the father-daughter dance, my fingers curled around the edge of my glass. Another when I bent down to pick up a child's dropped napkin. Another when I leaned against the garden railing, eyes half closed in the golden light of evening. I hadn't realized until then how long it had been since someone had looked at me without expectation. Julia was in the center of everything. She danced, she laughed, she made toasts with theatrical flair, her voice reaching the corners of the tent like an actress on opening night. People cheered, clapped, followed her lead. Adam looked happy, tired maybe, but swept up in the momentum of it all. I didn't interrupt. I didn't try to make space for myself. I let the day unfold. I could see the story Julia was trying to tell. A perfect celebration, curated, seamless, untouched by history. And she almost succeeded. Almost. But I knew that cameras, real ones, the kind wielded with intention, don't always obey the narrative. They catch more than what people want to show. They catch what's really there. Nathan's lens didn't follow the script. He didn't avoid me. He didn't reduce me to the woman in the corner. His camera found me in motion, in moments between glances, in gestures that carried more truth than speeches ever could. He captured what I had become, not invisible, not decorative, but quiet, rooted, present. Late in the evening, as the lanterns flickered and the music softened into slower melodies, I stepped away from the crowd. I walked toward the edge of the garden, where a few chairs sat empty. I stood there for a while, breathing in the night, listening to distant laughter. Then I heard the soft click of the shutter. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. For the first time in a very long while, I knew I was not just seen. I was remembered. 2 weeks passed before the packages began to arrive. Sturdy white boxes with satin ribbons, each hand-delivered by a courier dressed in black. The cards tucked inside bore elegant gold lettering. "Thank you for sharing our special day. Love, Adam and Julia." There were no personal notes, no messages to individuals. Just the boxes, the ribbons, and the weight of polished gratitude. My box sat unopened on the kitchen table for an entire day. I moved it aside to make tea, to read the mail, to water the plant on the windowsill. I wasn't afraid of it exactly, but I knew it held something final, something more conclusive than the ceremony itself. The album inside wasn't just photographs. It would be their version of the story, the final cut, the narrative Julia had so carefully staged. When I finally opened it, the scent of new paper and binding glue escaped like perfume. The cover was linen-bound, a soft cream with gold embossing. Their names, interlocked in cursive, shimmered under the light. Inside, thick pages cradled glossy photographs laid out with designer precision. The first image was the estate at sunset, breathtaking, golden, touched by a kind of light that made everything appear larger than life. The next few pages followed the sequence of the day: the bride's preparation, the groomsmen laughing on the porch, the clasping of hands, the archway framed by roses. And then I saw myself, not in the margins, not as a blur in the background, but there, clear, composed, alive. One photograph showed me standing near the edge of the courtyard, sunlight casting long shadows over my shoulders. Another captured me mid-step, walking alone, the hem of my dress catching the wind. I wasn't smiling, I wasn't posing, but the emotion in my eyes was unmistakable, something between nostalgia and quiet strength. Page after page, I appeared again. I wasn't the center of every frame, but I was present, consistently, truthfully, in the edges, in the reflections, in the silences between the scripted joy. There I was leaning slightly forward during the vows, a hand resting on my knee, my eyes intent on Adam. Another page showed me watching the dance floor from a garden bench, chin resting in my palm, a half smile playing at the corner of my lips. I saw myself laughing gently with a child who dropped his napkin, holding a glass of water, straightening a folding chair that had been knocked askew. None of these were moments meant for me. I hadn't performed for them. I hadn't expected to be included at all. And yet there I was, woven into the fabric of the day, not by intention, but by observation, by someone who saw me. I flipped the pages slowly, unsure whether to cry or simply exhale. It wasn't a victory I felt, not triumph, but recognition. After all the years of being in the background, of making room, of staying quiet, here I was, unstaged, unfiltered, unforgotten. I could only imagine Julia's face when she first saw the album, when she noticed me in frame after frame, not tucked away, not removed, but present with dignity and grace. She had wanted a flawless wedding, a display of curated beauty and perfection. She had designed the entire day like a campaign, every moment filtered, every detail approved. But photography, real photography, doesn't obey plans. It catches what exists when no one's looking. I turned the page and found an image that made my breath pause. It was of me standing alone near the arbor, just after the ceremony, facing away from the camera. The light fell across my back, and the train of my dress curved like a ribbon on the grass. There was something deeply human in the way the image had been captured. Solitude, yes, but not loneliness. Presence, not absence. And then came the closing pages, the couple under the stars, the final toast, the sparkler send-off. I watched as the narrative returned to them, just as it should, perhaps, but the memory of my inclusion lingered in every frame that had come before. The last page held a candid image of guests leaving the estate. In the corner, barely noticeable, I was embracing an older relative, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. We looked connected, mid-laughter, as if nothing had ever changed. I closed the album gently and sat still for a long while. No one had told Nathan to include me. No one had approved those shots. He had chosen them because he saw something the others didn't, or perhaps refused to see. Not just a woman pushed to the side, not just the mother of the groom, but someone real, someone whose story mattered, even in silence. I didn't reach out to thank him. I knew I wouldn't need to. The gratitude lived in the photographs, in the way he had framed the truth others tried to crop out. This was no revenge, no confrontation, no raised voices or final words. This was something quieter, something more lasting, proof, presence, and the kind of beauty that doesn't ask for permission to be seen. The phone calls started almost immediately after the albums were delivered. I hadn't even finished my second cup of coffee the morning after opening mine when the first message came in from my cousin Helen in Vermont. Her voice was bright, surprised, and a little amused. She told me how beautiful the album was, how elegant the ceremony looked, and then, with a lilt of curiosity, said, "And you? My goodness, you looked radiant." I thanked her, politely, trying not to let my voice shake. A few hours later, another message arrived. Then another. Then a flood. Messages from people I hadn't spoken to in months, some even years. Distant relatives, old neighbors, former colleagues who had somehow ended up on the guest list or received a forwarded copy. All of them said the same thing in different ways. How present I was. How striking. How natural. One woman, an old friend of Thomas's sister, told me she'd shown the album to her daughter, who was studying fine arts, and the girl had said, "This looks like a gallery spread. Who's the woman in blue? She looks like the heart of the whole story." I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. It became clear very quickly that Julia hadn't expected me to be so visible. I imagined the moment she opened her copy, expecting a parade of images focused on her carefully chosen decor, her custom-made gown, her curated circle of friends, and then, page by page, saw me, moving quietly through her masterpiece, uninvited by her, but impossible to erase. From what I gathered through small mentions and slips in conversation, she had tried to take control. There had been phone calls to the printer, inquiries about re-editing, questions about how the layout was finalized. But it was too late. The images had already been sent to dozens of homes. They had already been shared online, already admired, already printed and framed. The irony was too perfect. I hadn't planned anything. I hadn't posed, interfered, or spoken out. I had simply been there. And because Nathan had captured the truth, not the staged version, but the real breathing moments, I had become part of the wedding's visual memory in a way she never intended. I learned from someone close to the planning team that Julia was upset, but trying to remain composed. She told people she didn't mind the images, that it was sweet to have everyone represented. But I knew the difference between tolerance and regret. Her version of the story had been rewritten, not with words, but with a lens. The responses from the family kept coming. One uncle commented on how deeply connected I looked to the atmosphere of the day, as if I belonged more than anyone else. A distant niece said that her favorite image was the one of me in the garden, backlit by the sun, looking off into the distance with a half smile. These weren't just compliments, they were observations. People saw what was really there. And Adam, he was silent for a few days. I wasn't sure what he was thinking, or if he had even noticed how often I appeared in the album. Then, one evening, I saw his name flash across my phone screen. It wasn't a text, it was a call. He spoke softly, awkwardly. There were pauses. He told me the album was beautiful. He said he hadn't realized how many moments I had been a part of. He said that Julia was a little surprised, but that everyone kept mentioning you. Then he said something that caught me off guard. He said, "I think I forgot what you looked like when you were really at peace." That was the word that stayed with me. Peace. Because that's what the images had shown. Not defiance, not sadness, not exclusion. Peace. A quiet strength. A presence that refused to fade, not out of stubbornness, but out of truth. I wasn't angry with Julia. In a strange way, I understood her. She was young, ambitious, desperate to control the narrative of her life. I had been like that once, though perhaps not as fiercely. She didn't see me as an enemy. She saw me as a disruption to her image of perfection. But Nathan had reminded her, and everyone else, that perfection isn't the absence of the unexpected. Sometimes it's the grace of something unplanned slipping into the light. And so, there I was. Not because I fought to be seen, but because I had lived my life in a way that couldn't help but be seen when someone was truly looking. I didn't speak about it publicly. I didn't post the photos or comment on the stir. I let it pass quietly, like wind through tall grass. But in the stillness of those days after the album was shared, something subtle shifted in how people treated me. I was no longer just Adam's mother. I was no longer the woman in the corner. I had, without trying, taken up space, and that space was mine now. The house was quiet again. The flurry of wedding albums and phone calls had passed like a brief summer storm, loud, consuming, and then gone. But something inside me had shifted. The silence no longer felt like a punishment. It felt earned, peaceful, mine. I returned to my routines. Morning walks through the neighborhood, evening tea in the kitchen, where the light hit the walls just right at dusk. I cleaned out the closet where Thomas's jackets still hung, finally able to fold and donate them without feeling like I was erasing him. I rearranged the photographs on the mantel, moving one of Adam's childhood pictures closer to the center, not because I was clinging, but because I wanted him where I could see him again, without bitterness. The wedding album sat on the shelf within reach, but not constantly opened. I didn't need to revisit it every day. It was enough knowing it was there, that I had been seen, not because I demanded space, but because someone had the grace to offer it. The neighbors stopped by more often, bringing extra tomatoes from their garden, or just asking how I was. One of them mentioned the photos. She had seen them online through a mutual friend. "You look so graceful," she said, "like someone who belongs in a different time, a better one." I smiled and changed the subject, but her words lingered. I knew what she meant. Not that I looked old or out of place, but that I had carried something with me that couldn't be edited out. Something that no timeline or trend could obscure. It wasn't youth, it wasn't glamour, it was presence, dignity, a kind of beauty that doesn't announce itself but radiates quietly, the way morning light does through worn curtains. Julia never brought up the album again. We spoke now and then, polite exchanges mostly. She remained cordial, reserved, but I saw the way she paused when I entered a room, the way she looked at me differently, not warmer perhaps, but with the awareness that I was no longer invisible. She couldn't unsee what had been captured. And Adam? He came by more often, at first under the pretense of dropping something off, or needing help with something small. Then, with less excuse, one afternoon he stayed for lunch. We ate quietly, like we used to. He asked about my students, about the old days in the darkroom, about the first time I ever held a camera. It wasn't a flood of remorse, just a gentle stream of remembering. I didn't push. I let him come as he was. He asked to see the album again. I brought it down, placed it on the table, and stepped aside while he turned the pages. He stopped at a photograph of me standing alone near the hedge, hands clasped loosely in front of me, a breeze catching the edge of my scarf. He said nothing, just looked, and then, after a long while, he closed the book and looked up. There was something in his expression I hadn't seen since he was a boy. Not guilt, not shame, just recognition. We didn't talk about what had happened, about how I had been seated in the corner, pushed to the edge, about how Julia had tried to crop me out. We didn't need to. The photographs had said everything already. Later that week, I took out my old camera for the first time in years. The lens was dusty, the battery long dead. I ordered new film. I set up a space in the spare room where I could work again. Nothing serious, just light, shadows, still life. I didn't do it for anyone else. I did it for me, because somewhere in the act of being seen, I had remembered myself. I started photographing the world again. Not the posed moments, but the unnoticed ones. A cat asleep in a windowsill, a child pressing their hand against glass. My own reflection in the kettle, warped and silvery, but unmistakably mine. And as I did, I remembered what I used to tell my students. Beauty doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't fit neatly into frames. It exists defiantly in the in-between, in the unspoken, in the real. That was what had happened at the wedding. I hadn't reclaimed a place. I had simply remained where I already was. And in doing so, I reminded everyone, my son, my family, even myself, that some things, no matter how inconvenient or uninvited they may seem, cannot be hidden. Not when they are real, not when they are earned, not when they are beautiful.